But for this evening, we're having a cafe philo. We haven't done this for a long time, so it's a bit of an experiment. And it's somewhere where we sitting here on the, not quite a platform, we don't do too much of the work. It's up to you to do the work. And the subject this evening is building a better world. And that really gives you license to talk about almost anything. So I'll pass over to Andreas to put some meat on the bones.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Don, and welcome to all of you on this cold January wintry day. But it's great to see so many interested in how we can build a better world. That's encouraging, that's heartwarming to make sure that actually there's people care about these things, especially given what's going on in the news and in social media at the moment. So before we get into the mechanics of the day, this is going to be interactive, right? So I'm going to start just setting out the scene as per the flyer that you've got on your chair, and to start the debate going. I suggest we do this in 3 stages. We'll discuss what the state of the world is at the moment, and our opinions about that, and for good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, the question, how do we build a better world, could be perceived as being a slightly leading question. I don't think you should see it that way. If you believe we live in the best of all possible worlds, that's great. If you're a nihilist and you think there's no meaning to all of it, that's fine as well. So it wasn't meant to lead you in one direction or the other. But we'll start off with getting a feel of what we all think the state of the world is. We then progress to the second stage where we think about, well, what do we need to really fix then? What are the key things that really need some attention in the world? And then we finish off the third stage by looking at how do we actually go about doing that? It's all well good in saying this needs to be fixed, but do we have ideas in terms of what it would take to actually build a better world? So the flyer you've got before you is really just a taster. And it's all about the progress that humanity has made is very considerable in the sciences, in technology. We are now basically at the cusp at our own future evolution. We're probably the only species on the planet that have actually reached this stage so far. And with that comes lots of technology, lots of science, lots of medical advances. Literacy in the world has improved. Health outcomes have improved around the world. So there's plenty to be positive about. But some of this comes at a cost. And that comes at an environmental cost, it comes at a social cost, it comes at a political cost that we are beginning to feel. So what we'll start off with is discussing the state of the world. I've got 2 volunteers in the back. I've got Mike here with his hand up with the microphone, and I've got Neil on the other side with the microphone as well, who's going to do this side. The reason why it's important to raise your hand to ask the first question or make your first contribution is that we've got an online audience who are all on the screen behind you. And before we start, online audience, feel free to unmute yourself and show your video if you want to ask a question. If you're shy and you don't want to do that, then you can put your question in the chat room and I can ask it or raise it or your comments on your behalf. So feel free to unmute and show your video when you want to make a contribution, otherwise put it in the chat room. So we'll start off with the current state of the world. Any views? Who wants to go first? Lady in the back.
Sorry, I just decided to go first because no one else was raising their hand. The one thing that I think is happening in the world right now is it's driven a lot by greed. Greed for everything, greed for power, greed for money, greed for health, greed for food, greed for more. That's the only point I want to make.
And just before you hand it over, in what way is that due to the capitalist structure of consumerism?
I was going to come to that, which I completely forgot when I was speaking. It is driven largely by the capitalistic worldview.
And do you think that's ubiquitous around the world, or are there pockets where that isn't the case?
Good question. The majority is how it is as a result of the capitalistic driven view. There might be pockets where that's not the case, but they are in such a minority. They are, I don't even know if there are such cases, but I'm sure there must be some.
Okay. Well, thank you much. So this is obviously the first contribution. So we are in a world that is driven in the Western world, certainly, by capitalism and by consumption, where we seem to be more concerned about material possessions than necessarily the relationships we have with each other. So that's one contribution. Thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful. Any other views?
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So for me, the world is in a mess, but it's in an evolutionary mess. So it kind of needs to be where it is because we need to be learning lessons, and the shark hasn't evolved at all in the last 100 million years because it's perfectly adapted for its environment. Where are we going? What's the direction of travel is an interesting question. But where we are right now is not the end of the game for me. So there's an evolutionary impulse at work, and this is part of it. The environmental crisis is not really a crisis of the environment, it's a crisis of consciousness. And until we learn how to treat each other, how to treat ourselves, things aren't going to move forward. So this is a journey, for me, first of all, an internal journey, which then gets articulated externally.
So before we hand back, because I think that's a really interesting point. So you started off by saying we're on an evolutionary process, a journey. So therefore, we are where we ended up being as a result of evolution. But then, at the same time, he then expanded and says, well, actually, we need to learn how to treat each other differently. So say a bit more about that, because that feels as if that's not just a given, that's something that we can change.
Yes, I think that we treat, I'm actually coming from a psychological perspective. So I see that basically everything stems from who I think I am, and I then project that out into the world and create the world that I expect and anticipate. So, for example, greed. The question isn't about greed for me. The question is, where does greed come from? What is the lack that I experience that makes me greedy? So it's kind of wanting to unpack it more deeply psychologically to then really be able to kind of ask questions about what's the direction of travel, where are we heading? And the answer to that question for me is love. And that is a big question.
Okay, no, thank you. Who would like to go next? So far we've had greed and an inner journey of discovery and love.
I was going to disagree, I'm afraid, respectfully, that I don't consider this to be an evolutionary crisis. Evolution hasn't really affected what's happened over the last few hundred years or the last few thousand years. That's very much a sort of intellectual development and an understanding through science, philosophy, and other things, and that doesn't come from evolution. And I think there's a danger in thinking of it in terms of evolution, because when we come to the section on how to manage the situation, waiting for evolution to sort it out is absolutely not the answer. Okay, so just before you hand the microphone back, so you think the state of the world that we live in is man-made to some extent, yeah? Is that what we're saying? We're saying it's actually the humanity have got themselves into this situation. It's not an evolutionary process, natural process of natural selection. It's a human artifact now over the last few thousand years in terms of the global societies we've built and the world in which we live.
Is that what you said?
I think it's the speed of expansion of the human population by increasing survival and reproduction skills, and also then our intellectual understanding, our understanding of science, and our ability to manipulate the world and the planet that is the problem. And that doesn't, to my mind, come from evolution as such. Okay, so evolution was required to get to that point. But I don't think the problems of the last few hundred or few thousand years can be attributed to evolution. I think we have to look elsewhere for the explanations of how we got here in more recent times, and we certainly need to look for a different solution.
So you mentioned population increase and technological advance. Do you think the world is in sort of relative balance at the moment, or how do you feel about the state of the world as it is right now?
If I was going to sum up the state of the world, I would say unsustainable is probably the single word I would use. And we have to decide whether it's the human population or the lifestyles that we live that is unsustainable. But unsustainability would be the one word I would use to sum up the world at the moment.
Surely the population explosion has become almost a thing of the past. There are many countries that are suffering a decline in population, although some parts of the world are not doing that.
Absolutely.
Can I just
of course.
put in two brief comments myself? First of all, we had someone talking about greed.
Yeah.
Why are people greedy? They're greedy because they are manipulated daily into being greedy. Let's be absolutely honest. It is not their natural greed. It is a deliberate industry that manipulates them into greed. And secondly, the population thing absolutely baffles me. For years, people have been worried about overpopulation. Now we have people who are worried about the fact the population is going down. I would have thought it was something to be celebrated. So I really find that just bizarre.
Okay, but before we go to the next one, just in terms of the population, because I wrote a book about this a while ago. I wrote a book in 2011 called A Different Future, at which point we had 7 billion people on the planet. So, fast forward 12 years on, 2023, 2024, we reached 8 billion people. When I wrote this book, the UN maximum projection by the end of this century was going to be 14 billion people on the planet, which then you could ask the question whether it's sustainable or not. However, since then, they have vastly reduced that upper limit, and they believe now that we're going to be peaking in 2050 or so at around 10.5, 10.75 billion, and then have a slow decline. So I think the population explosion concern that we had a decade ago is not quite as intense right now as it was. But obviously, as Don said, it depends on different pockets in the world. Some parts of the world are still increasing quite rapidly. Other peoples have got more or less a fatal decline. Even European countries like Italy, for example, and Japan. There's the only thing that keeps the Japanese population up is that they're the longest lived population in the world.
Yes, South Korea has become quite alarmed about it.
Yeah.
They have the world record for population decline.
Yeah, exactly. This gentleman.
Yes, well, a couple of key things that close to my heart. I study, or one of the things that I'm very interested in, and you touched on, and that's balance. So I would say that we have a lot of imbalances in the world with regard to our balance between ourselves and nature. So I believe that we should be looking to some of the ancient wisdom of Taoism, and also how cultures in the past, like the Native American Indians, were able to live in much closer harmony and happier, and without this feeling of greed, although having said that, perhaps there was ongoing sort of tribal wars. I think that we very much need to be looking at how we can bring more balance back to where it needs to be. And population, I think there is a delicate balance there with regard to growth and sustainability. You mentioned Korea. My second home is Taiwan. And it's very interesting how there are all sorts of problems coming from an all too quickly declining population, but perhaps it's critical that we do better understand the balance that is optimal, so that we can look at this more closely as part of our realigning some of the critical things that we have to do.
Okay, before you hand your microphone back, just a quick question. In terms of showing more communality in groups of people, you know, historically that's always been perceived to be easier in smaller communities rather than larger communities. Now, I would like to understand your view, given that we live in mega populations nowadays, within countries, never mind between countries, do you feel that the world is becoming more nationalistic rather than cooperative?
I think that it depends on our, I don't know whether this sounds a bit snobby, but our education.
Right.
And so I think those that are not so educated, I sort of fail to understand how sort of America has been split so much. But I do think that this appreciation of some of what's important from the point of view of national pride, in terms of biggest, best, fastest, as opposed to some of the sort of higher value things that are sort of perhaps perceived from higher intellect to be more important or more valuable. So
yeah. Okay, so more from an individualistic to a more shared.
yes, and I would say that's very much a key thing, that we need to go from me. At the moment is very much a case of what can I do for my wealth, my status to we as a community. So, and I think that's very much a critical thing that needs to be happening.
Okay, so currently we're straying into the next stage, which is about what needs to be fixed. But I think what you're saying is we're currently inhabiting a world of individuals rather than of shared values. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that shared values and trying to get more on a good page rather than a page that's unsustainable.
Okay, good. Excellent. Is the light on?
It's on. Hello, is that on?
Yep.
Excuse me. Linking up some of the things that have been said, population and greed and capitalism. I remember hearing 40 years or more ago, when there was a lot of emphasis on population, someone came out with the notion that a single American baby is more of a disaster for the world than 100 Indian babies. And it comes back to the resources that they will be demanding as they grow up. Now, within our own society, of course, we've got to start thinking of the super rich. And the super rich have come about by the sort of capitalism that we've moved into, you know, the neoliberal capitalism. And somehow we've got to, you know, we hear it said that 0.1% of the population are consuming vast amounts of resources and emitting vast amounts of carbon. We've got sort of private jets running up and down the country. Somehow we've got to overcome that, rather than thinking initially of just population numbers. I mean, obviously population numbers do come into it, but the super rich, somehow we've got to do something about this, and tax, cheating on tax and the huge amounts that we see. I mean, we've got, what's his name, Musk. I thought Musk was a type of rat, but...
It is.
so much money, and this is at someone else's expense anyway. I should pass on.
Well, no, it's quite interesting because you talk about capitalism and drawing together some of the other themes, which is quite interesting. Do you feel that capitalism, neo-capitalism, has become synonymous with a liberal democracy?
Not liberal democracy. Neoliberal capitalism is not liberal democracy.
I think I would challenge that.
Everything in capitalism has become financialised. And, you know, the City of London is not doing what it was originally intended to, which was to raise money for enterprise. It's now become a casino. And then the money that's being taken out of the economy by these rich, well, I was about to swear, these rich in the city, you know, I mean, they're not doing anything for our country or for the world, just making themselves rich.
Okay, thank you.
I think I would agree that there is a problem, that there has been a tendency to concentrate wealth among a few people, but the numbers are so very small that I would completely challenge the fact that they're significant in the consumption of resources. After all, even Elon Musk can only eat so many meals a day.
So that he can emit a lot of carbon from his private jet.
Quite negligible when you consider the number of private jets. It's all our motor cars that are issuing much more. And it's
Don, a fact check. These people produce up to 10,000 times the the carbon footprint of the rest of the world.
Okay.
They really do.
Yes,
This gentleman is absolutely right.
But there are so few of them that 10,000 is a small
Well, there's
number.
enough of them to produce serious problems.
Yeah. Well, let's pick that point now. Remember that point of inequality and capitalism and how that is generating inequality, which is unsustainable going forward. Good. We've got another 3 or 4 or 5 minutes on this topic, then we go on to the solutions. Please.
How do we, those of us who are not in the room, how do we raise our hands?
You raise your hand. Sorry, I didn't pick you up. Please, why don't you go ahead? We're going to have your first online one. Jennifer, please carry on.
Okay. One of the things I think we haven't mentioned yet about the state of the world is that our advances in technology have exceeded our ability to control that technology. And I think that I'm thinking particularly of social media. And I think as a species, we are very suggestible. We like to listen to stories. And I think when you have the juxtaposition of, as somebody mentioned earlier, lamentably undereducated people who don't understand how you verify the truth of an argument or something that's placed on social media, and the power of that social media, I think it's become an extremely destabilizing force.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And that's obviously, it's very topical today, given that Meta and Instagram have announced they're doing away with fact-checking and leaving it up to their community.
Which is appalling and terrifying.
So you think technology is a potential danger, or that we have reached a technological stage which we're no longer necessarily in control of? Is that your point?
I certainly think so. And also you've got the wealth that is accumulated. The wealthiest people in the world are the tech barons now. And so they have dual power. They have the power over over the means of communication, and then they have power over governments as well, as we're seeing particularly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. I think they're influencing elections. So I think it's a huge threat.
Jennifer, thank you very much for being our first online participant who said something. That's really great. We're going to go back into the room for one, and then Trevor, we come to you, if that's okay, yeah? Okay.
Well, what about me? I was first.
Oh, so Roger, we go to somebody in the room, then to you, Roger, and then to Trevor. In the room first, and then we go to Roger.
Okay, thank you. So she used the term undereducated, I think, but I was more like wanting to use the term ignorance, because people are ignorant about history, about like their own life. They don't take a step back to critique what is happening around them. And also they don't take a step back to think about what they are saying. Particularly when you go to social media, you see people are so full of hatred, afraid of difference, afraid of people who don't look like them. And that's come from a place of ignorance, I think. And the second problem with our world is like, the world power have decided to make the world better after the World War, creating big institutions that will make the rule of law international law. And we are witnessing a time where these own nations are trying to violate these things. And I'm afraid in the future we might be in a place where it will be a no man's land. People will do just like what they want and they no more care. And this is actually happening in my country, where like politicians and military government don't care about the law. They don't care because they are saying, oh, these people who are talking about international or human rights are violating this same right. So we don't care. We are going to keep violating that same right. So I think we really have to take a step back, think about history, about our own life, and how we can change things around us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So this is much more about, rather than being uneducated, we're ignorant. And ignorance in this case is definitely not bliss. So, okay, Roger, sorry to have missed you off. Your turn.
Yeah, we talked about evolution earlier. My view is that human progress has been driven by cultural evolution. That's evolution in technology, organization, knowledge, and culture. And that's why mankind has exceeded all other animals on this planet. Now, this cultural evolution is accelerating. And at the moment, because evolution is blind, it's driving us forward to destroy the planet and to create a more unequal society. Now, we know how to get round it, but the question is mankind clever enough to get round it? And at the moment, it doesn't seem like it is. I would support the previous speaker, Jennifer, who's saying that we've unleashed all this technology on mankind and we are not yet able to develop the culture to control it.
Okay, that's great, Roger. So thank you for that. So do you think then that which aspects of the technology are you particularly worried about?
Well, I'm obviously worried. Well, there's the internet and all the interactions resulting from that, the social media, the ability of mankind to upgrade war, and all aspects of technology, but mostly, I think, the social media side.
Right.
We don't know the effect of the social media of the next generation yet on our culture.
I'm surprised, actually, we haven't mentioned the two-letter word yet, AI. But I'm sure we'll get there. So, Trevor, you're next.
Yes, good evening. I hope you can hear me. I just want to come back to this question of shared values, because this idea comes up again and again and again when we talk about the future. If we all started thinking we rather than me, the world would be a better place. I think I'm of the opinion that we all, every person in the world has shared values. We already share a lot of values. Go and ask anybody anywhere in the world what they want to have. They want to have things like security. They want to have that sort of thing. So we already share those values. The problem, I think, is the lack of leadership to bring those shared values together, because the people who want to get themselves elected as leaders, wherever that is in the world, are more interested in a personal viewpoint, a personal agenda, or a political agenda, not concentrating on using those shared values. I think it already exists. It's a question of how to bring it, how to use it.
So why do we elect them then?
That's a very good question. We could go into that. We're going to have a session on democracy a little bit later in this year, I think.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to give a talk about democracy under attack in less than 2 weeks. So
yes, that's going to be very interesting.
So we'll pick it up then.
I think the question of shared values and cooperation and everybody being much more moral, I think we're in danger of becoming naive here and taking a utopian approach, because essentially people are selfish. I am, all of you are. So
It's a statement and a half.
is how can we achieve cooperation? It's a fragile thing, and it's something that has to be developed with care.
Yeah.
But if I can just come back, that selfishness, in fact, contributes to the good of society. Think of Adam Smith, what he said. I mean, he only wrote about the things about shared values and things that people, by being selfish, contribute to the wealth of the rest of the people. It works by being selfish.
Yes, it works to some extent in when you can approximate to a perfect market, but of course there are many parts of our lives which don't work as a perfect market, and these have to be addressed differently. For example, if you think about street lighting, you couldn't arrange that everybody pays for their own light. That doesn't work. So some things we have to do communally.
Yes.
I just want to make, can you hear that okay?
Yep.
If we were having this discussion in the Congo or Myanmar or South Africa, we'd be having a completely different discussion.
Yeah.
This is a very Eurocentric, very Northern Hemisphere type of discussion. I think we need to think much broader. We are in a rapidly moving into a bipolar or tripolar world. As to value systems, anyone who knows anything about spiral dynamics knows there are about 8 or 9 value systems, and they're not the same. And they differ between you being in an I mode or a we mode, depending on your existential conditions.
Yeah.
And these different types of value systems are quite antagonistic to each other. So I think we need, even from a psychological point of view, we need to think in a much broader way. I've worked in over 50 countries as a botanist, and I've seen the destruction and the deterioration of the planet on a big scale. And yeah, I agree with the speaker at the back. People don't have a historical perspective. We don't teach it in schools even. So I just wanted to make us look in a broader, that actually there are 7 billion people, but we're talking about probably 2 billion at max.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the gentleman at the back?
Just a further note on the, is it Claire Grace with the spiral dynamics or on that general consensus? One of the main points of that, is it not that there's a convergence of values, that it follows a humanistic Jungian progression of individuation towards consciousness. And so my general positioning would be between these two gentlemen here. My sense is that our next century, we're on the cusp of a next, I guess, atomic bomb, but as an intrapsychic one. And it's one of kind of stable instability. I think there's a lot of, I come from a psychological background. There's a lot of hidden malaise. Think like what I deem to be called a kind of selfless society, one where individuals are disconnected both from themselves and from an I-thou perspective, disconnected from other. They cannot look into another person's eyes and see another being for who they are. And I think as we disconnect from this and as we disconnect from other people, we're creating this polarized world where if we cannot reclaim our consciousness and band ourselves together, we can either create the atomic bomb that destroys our world, or we create one where we harness good energy and a collectiveness that can, in a sense, revolutionize our social technologies. Because I think from a technological perspective, I used to work in a lot of tech consulting, but now I work in public health, and I think Michel Foucault would be rolling in his grave to see the kind of status manipulation happening to our minds. And that's my general sense. I don't think it's completely bad, but I think we have a lot of power at our hands, and it's not just about social media and digital technology. We have a lot of social control. You talk Elon Musk, for instance, but also the power of any leader on any side of any political spectrum.
Okay, thank you. So this is interesting, isn't it? Because what you're effectively saying is, in a world where we are potentially more connected than ever before through social media and the internet, we're actually more disconnected from each other personally. So I think that's quite a powerful statement to make. Now, I think this probably, just looking at the time, we need to leave a little bit of time. So we've now got the state of the world, and I think the state of the world is that we started off with greed is bad, and we more or less got to the opposite point of view where greed is good. It reminds me of the wolf on Wall Street, Gecko, I think his name was, who said that greed is good. And so there's lots of opinions here. So we've got a good flavor of what we believe, and I'm taking the gentleman's point of view, probably a fairly sort of northern hemisphere, western hemisphere centered view of the world, but at least we've got a range of views. Can we spend the next 20 minutes or so thinking about what are the really crucial things that we need to get right given the state of the world we've actually got? What do we need to really fix? What are the top 10 things that would make a big difference to the world in which we live? Who would like to go first here? Anybody online? No, not online yet.
Well,
in the room.
I think one of the things is to
there's a gentleman here, sorry. Then I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I'm going to suggest it's the food system, simply because we all need food on a daily basis.
Closer.
We all need food.
Yeah.
On a daily basis. But actually something like 30% of all food grown is wasted. It's reflective of the market system that is not really a market system. I mean, basically, food companies put profit before people or the planet. And I think it would be an exemplar, if you like, of what needs to change in a wider system, but it is something that affects all of us on a daily basis. And obviously the downside of the food system that we've got, which is basically making profit by adding sugar, fat and salt, is causing an obesity epidemic, which in turn has an impact on health systems, mental health, well-being, musculoskeletal systems. So I think as an exemplar, looking at the food system is a good place to start. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, no, that's good.
Well, of course, we are looking forward to next month, Julian Bergini talking about just that. So in terms of what you're saying, so one of the key things in your opinion that needs to be fixed in the world is the way we consume and the way we consume food specifically. Do you want to expand on that? What are some of the solutions that you see?
Yeah, I think the solutions are more difficult because we've got so far down this track of making profit before putting people and the planet first. It's going to be very difficult to reverse, but reverse it does have to, simply because it's a reflection of consumerism, and we just can't keep this concept of continuous growth is just not sustainable. And obviously, food production has an impact on climate change. Access to food is an equity issue. I mean, it actually just reflects many of the discussions that we've had already about the problems in the world. But it's a very tangible, everyday problem.
Yes.
It's a good place to start.
Okay, well, the third part of the solution, so maybe we'll keep it to that.
Indulge me in a small story here.
Yeah, of course.
I was working in the Soviet Union in the 1990s, and I remember walking down the street and seeing a supermarket, and the shelves were all completely empty, except there were a few loaves at the end. And I went down a little bit further, and the lady translator with me, I said, why is this crowd outside this completely empty shop? She said, oh, there's a rumor that there's going to be a delivery. And the Soviet system was completely broken. And some of the people I was working with came over here. And when they went and saw a modern supermarket here, they were simply amazed.
And I think that would be true for many people in Africa. Coming over here.
So
I mean, why do we need 6 different types of baked bean?
Have done the experiment for us.
Yeah.
We don't want to repeat that.
No. And the other side of Moscow is the Kremlin. Just huge wealth, just beyond any imagination. You know, it is people in power that create more power, more wealth, but for themselves. It's not an equitable system.
Okay, so we'll have one of the critical factors as far as you're concerned is the food consumption, production, the whole food chain, yeah? Internationally, good. Anybody else got any other views? People in the back. Colin and...
Can I return to something we were talking about a few minutes ago about shared values? I'm not sure I quite agree with the concept of shared values. I think in some basic way we have the same values, but what we do have is very, very different priorities. So we don't share priorities. So generally speaking, our first priority is ourselves, our family, and then we have a gradually diminishing responsibility or priority for other people. And the ways of dealing with our priorities is either by cooperating or by conflict. And I think the most important thing for any solution is to try and prioritize rewarding cooperation and not rewarding conflict.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I say something?
So I just want to say, like, for me, greed is not bad. It depends which kind of greed we have, because it's because of greed that people look for more knowledge, more way to change the world. So for me, greed is not that negative. But coming back to a question about how one thing we can change, Obama said about Africa, where I come from, that we don't need strong men, we need strong institutions. But I think that doesn't apply to Africa alone. It applies to the whole world, particularly the West. We need institutions that are not paid by lobbyists to defend corporation interest. And for that, when we have those institutions, we will have food, healthy food. We will have good and strong health institutions. So we just need to change our systems that are not funded by lobbyists and stuff. Thank you.
Okay, was there somebody online? Did I miss a contribution? Was that you,
No,
Roger?
I'm just going to say the obvious things, if I can. I mean, the obvious things we've got to solve are climate change, declining biodiversity, overexploitation of the oceans, the whole emigration issue caused by climate change and wars, and things like COVID. All these things are happening. They will happen, and we're not doing enough about them.
Roger, thank you very much for mentioning climate change, because I was surprised. We've been going for 45 minutes or so, and nobody's mentioned climate change in detail. So thank you, Roger, for that. So that's one of the big ones. And the lady before, I didn't quite catch that. What was, if you summarized it in one sentence, what do you think we need to fix?
We need to fix our institutions to make sure that the politicians we put there to represent us are not paid by the corporation that we are blaming.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a good point, and we've covered that earlier in terms of politicians, which is great. Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I think in the first part we discussed a lot about shared values, and I think I would agree with what seems to be the majority view, that actually we don't all share the same values. And I think if you look, I'm taking it back to the other point, which was about evolution. I think if you look at history and you look at nature, the kind of the values that we think are shared now are not necessarily the values that you see in nature, and it's definitely not what you would have seen as, you know, when a Roman army marched into a city to siege it. Those were not the same values that we think that everyone shares now. I think we've done a very good job in the Northern Hemisphere, in the Western world, of kind of wrapping ourselves in a morality. And a big point of that is, and we'd like to think a big part of that is that we should be compassionate to those who are less fortunate and who need it. And we should be compassionate in society. And I think that is something that we need to see, I think, more universal acceptance of, and before we can even start to think about how to actually start solving kind of the sub-issues of things like food and climate change. I think everyone has to be on kind of a similar playing field about what is actually important before we can get to moving on to that.
And do you agree with a previous speaker who felt that needs to be done not by the individual, but probably by our politicians and overall governance, or do you think differently?
In terms of who actually
creates the environment in which shared values can flourish?
That's a big question. Well, I don't know. I would like to think it's a battle of ideas, right? And it's a thing for debate. And I don't necessarily think our politicians are maybe the team captains we want for that.
Right.
But who is best, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay. No, thank you.
Can I? May I? Hello?
Yes.
Sorry.
So who's
sure whether
online?
we're
Is that
going
Jennifer
online.
again?
Yes, it is.
Jennifer, sorry. Carry on.
So I wanted to address two of the previous speakers. One, you asked who should set those values, and whether we do or don't have shared values. I think there's a difference between individual values and what a government wants to do. Like the Roman, we used the example of the Roman armies invading whatever country it might have been at the time. That was the value of the leadership. It wasn't necessarily the value of the people who were being ruled. And so I think the answer is that the government should more accurately reflect the desires of the individuals, because I do think that as human beings, as individuals, we tend to have largely shared values. We love our families. We want to take care of our families. We want to be healthy. We want to live to our full potential, whatever. We value our own lives. Governments don't necessarily do that. They send the poorest and the least able to say no into battle on their behalf. And then the other point that was being raised was about corporations and governments. And I think one of the things we need to do is to stop governments from being captured by multinational corporations. So one of the things we need to fix is the power of multinational corporations.
Good. Trevor, before I leave you out, have you got something else to say, or shall we go back into the room?
No, I have got something else to say. Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to what you said at the beginning of this section, Andreas. You said, what are the top 10 things, or what are the 10 things that we need to sit about fixing? I want to go back to the question of this session. It said, how do we build a better world?
Yeah.
Solving any of those problems that we've mentioned, environment, etc., are not going to build a better world at all, I don't think. Building means you've got to start from the bottom and build it up to something. So solving those problems are important, and we'll have to tackle them, or we'll be partly destroyed or completely destroyed. So we have to tackle those problems, but we have to do something more basic if we want to build a better world. And it comes back again to leadership and recognizing these, what I've called shared values, to build from the basis. And that comes back to what someone's already mentioned, education of people, to build from the basis of a better world. It's a long-term project, but we're not going to build a better world by solving the immediate problems.
Okay.
Shall I?
Can I say something here?
Thanks. We've heard a lot of different opinions over here. We're talking about shared values, and the point I wanted to make was, are we even thinking about shared planet? Because everyone seems to have come from a point of human race, and I'm thinking this planet is inhabited not just by the human race. So if we start thinking about the planet as a home rather than our home as a home or our country as a home, that would change the mindset of the impact that every individual or organizations or communities will have. And I think that change in mindset, that we share this planet with not just other human beings, but other living beings, will probably drive our consciousness towards a better life. And when we talk about education, lack of ignorance, what kind of education are we talking about? If we do not understand the impact of how every human being, every living being is going to be affected by our own actions, how much advancement is enough, or how much more do we need to advance? We are now invading space. We've got so many LEOs orbiting around Earth just for communication. Where is this communication driving us? Do we really need to be that connected? So I think that's the question we need to ask from the perspective of we are not the sole inhabitants of this planet.
Okay, well, thank you very much, because I think that broadens it out very nicely. You know, that takes us actually not just from shared values in the family, in the tribe, in the community, or even the country, to actually beyond the human race, which I think is, you know, it's probably what you're referring to is shared values across the whole sort of biosphere, rather than just the humanity. That's interesting. So we've looked at various, I'm looking at the time here, so I think we do need, Trevor is absolutely right, we probably need to move on now to how do we actually build a better world. Because we've looked at stage one, we had our views of what the world is like, which has been quite diverse, to say the least, in the audience. Then in terms of what needs to be fixed, it's also been quite broad, and we've covered lots of things from food to climate change, to governance, to shared values, politics, capitalism, etc. So there's quite a few things here. So let's spend the last sort of 20 minutes or so thinking about how do we actually go about doing that. What I felt resonated with most of you seems to be the way we're governing ourselves and the way we establish shared values is one. So why don't we start here? What can we do specifically to actually create better shared values and have a governance where these shared values are expressed more effectively, rather than they are currently by our political leaders at present, by the sounds of it. So there's a gentleman at the back, and then...
Actually, I will, if I may. The state of the world at the moment is high levels of misery. There are large proportions of the population, I'm not going to get back to the human level, but large proportions of humanity are living in misery through food or economic or social causes of misery. And I have heard people saying we need to have connected values, we need to have compassion, but at the moment, what we need to get rid of is the attitude that we can ignore and accept these things as part of the world. And our political leaders are quite prepared to do that. So are our commercial leaders, are quite happy for people to ignore that challenge.
So how do we hold them to account? Because that's basically what we're saying is how do you build a better framework here that seems to be working rather than not working for the vast majority of people?
Again, glibly it goes back to education, but more significantly, you can educate a person who's starving, but if he's starving, he's not going to use that education. You've got to get rid of that underlying population of starvation and misery.
Yeah.
And you can do that by spending our money. It's a question of redistribution.
But that's an interesting thing, isn't it? You know, that's actually an interesting point. Would this make a difference if we actually had a say in terms of how governmental and corporate money was spent? And you know that we would be accountable to some extent to making decisions around where the money gets spent, rather than voting once every 5 years and then leaving it up to the politicians to carve up the tax dollars or pounds for the next 3 or 4 years.
Yes, and I think the answer to your question is yes. If we were given the chance to, if the majority of people in this country, for instance, were given that opportunity, a lot of them would bring in the death penalty, they'd get rid of anybody who didn't come from this country, and so on. So wouldn't necessarily bring about compassion.
No. I was just thinking about Switzerland, where they seem to have a referendum every week in terms of direct democracy. Okay, just moving to Bill, because I think Bill has had his hand up for a long time online. So we're going to go online. Bill, are you still with us, and can you hear us? And if you could unmute, that'd be great.
Yes, I'm here now. I'm putting up a point in the chat room because we had quite a lot of discussion about shared values. And one vehicle for demonstrating shared values is bringing citizens' assemblies much more into the political agenda. They seem to encourage people to be more tolerant of other people's point of views and come up with quite often very sensible suggestions for taking issues forward. Why can't we put citizen assemblies into the political agenda?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Isn't this something that some political parties would actually favour? Bill?
I'm not sure. I think the Greens do. I think the Lib Dems have been lukewarm on the issue. The trouble is, it takes power away from the main parties. So you really find that most politicians instinctively don't like the idea.
Okay, but it sounds as if some direct citizen involvement, it would be actually a positive way forward.
I think that's one way of getting the shared values higher up the agenda, certainly.
Okay. I think the gentleman there, this one there, and then we come back to you. Oh, sorry, this gentleman in the back. You're going to be next.
Okay. I was going to say this at the beginning, but it fits well here. We're at a real technological tipping point now. And the main reason I say this, I work in biosciences, biotech. AI is a bit of a red herring. There is so much money going into longevity at the moment. And the biggest subset of longevity is the brain-computer interface research, where Musk, again, has got this company Neuralink, so hooking us up to computers, which would prolong our life, takes us into this whole idea of transhumanism, which I'm sure you've debated. I was talking about this in the EU 15 years ago. They were worried about this, wondering when it's come. It's almost here. So then we face this divergence. Do we want to be part of that? Or do I talk to my partner, how long do I want to live now? I feel that I've lived a good life. I would rather my kids have a good life. I think that we have a sort of moral duty to think about this, the resources that we take out of the planet and so on. So, yeah, I think we're at this point that all of us in this room are going to have to face now. How long do we want to actually live now and face that up? And then I think a lot of things stem from that.
Okay, so how would this help to fix some of the things we've talked about earlier? How does that help us to build a better world?
Well, it would lead to more equitable use of resources. I mean, why am I sitting on, I don't have a £4 million house, but why am I sitting on all that money now that it's just going to die and then suddenly it'll be part, why don't I release that to be more productive uses? Why am I still being so acquisitive and taken in by all these new opportunities, just senselessly buying things? Yeah, it would help us all reevaluate, I think, our role and then to find these shared values.
And do you see, because you mentioned transhumanism, do you have the same outlook for posthumanism?
I'm not sure posthumanism, I only got as far as transhumanism, which was, is this the body we're meant to have? And now, both with, I can give you back the same arm, I can replace a lost limb, I can give you a better limb back.
Yeah, okay.
As well. And we are at that stage technologically now, we can do that, almost rebuild your whole body. And then if we link you into a computer, we get into this argument that, we only use 5% of our brain's capacity. What if we could enhance that? And that would be a way to do it. And as I say, there are about 5 companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink who are getting, this is the thing that the Silicon Valley guys are investing in more than AI at the moment.
Okay. I think the gentleman, no, this gentleman, I think, yes, this gentleman here, sorry, because you've waited and then we go over there again.
I thought it might be helpful to refer back to Abraham Maslow, who was a great social scientist years ago, he offered us a framework which he called the hierarchy of needs. And in terms of our discussions about values, it is very difficult to not be Eurocentric, as it's already someone has mentioned. But when you consider Maslow's hierarchy and then consider how the world's values are going to slot into that framework, you can see that if you're living in, shall we say, a culture or just an environment where the key basis of Maslow's hierarchy is food and shelter. Now, lots of parts of the world, their values are set by we've got to do what we have to do to have food and shelter. Mm-hmm. Whereas we are at the upper end of the hierarchy, probably looking for status in our positions in society, or indeed looking for self-actualization, as he put it. Indeed, self-actualization may be a sort of disease which is permeated the social media on a vast scale. So I mention it as a way of thinking about how we should be thinking about values in a world perspective. And in another aspect, perhaps draw you towards the Greek idea of Gaia, Mother Earth. Mother Earth, we are very anthropocentric as we are thinking that all this is all about us, people, how we can fathom out what to do. Whereas if we think of Gaia, Mother Earth, what is its or her aspect in all this? So I would ask you to, perhaps if there was time one of these days, I'll sing you a small sonnet about Gaia. Okay, thank you very much.
No, but I think you make some very good points. So I think the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is clearly shows if you are on the rung of survival and you're in a war-torn country where you don't know whether you're going to live the next day or not, then you're not going to have these kind of highfalutin discussions that we're having today. You know, you're much more interested in your survival. I think what I would say though is at a global level, at a shared human level, we all have responsibilities to actually think about these things, to enable people not to be in a position where they have to constantly worry about their own survival, their shelter, and everything else. That is partly our responsibility. And the gentleman who talked about food, for example, you know, a significant proportion of the world population do not have enough to feed themselves. It's not because there's insufficient food in the world. It's just the way that the food is distributed. That is the issue. So, some more comments. The gentleman here in the middle, and then I'll come back to you. Oh, and then the lady at the back, sorry.
2 years ago, I went to hear a talk by George Monbiot at Bristol University, and there were about 400 students or young people in that audience. And he outlined most of what we've been talking about as the problem. And they kept coming up and saying, what is the solution?
Yeah.
And I thought about that, and all he could say was, we need a new story. I was fortunate enough to be the founding director of a £60 million Millennium Project in the National Botanic Garden of Wales. And in the building of that, I knew absolutely no idea how to do it, but I developed a strategy how to do it. And this is my story for the future. Economic prudence, environmental sustainability, social justice, social responsibility, all in aligned interest. And if you get it right, you'll be spiritually fulfilled. In other words, and I've applied this to multiple projects from student theses to other large-scale projects, and it works. If I had time, I could give you some really exciting examples. It can come from the individual, and it can come from a group of people. I'm working with somebody at the moment in Hay-on-Wye who's trying to make Hay-on-Wye a completely self-sufficient town. And they're starting to apply some of these principles.
Thank you very much.
Whatever project you do, if you can do it in the most cost-effective way, without affecting people, rather enhancing people, enhancing the environment, and in an aligned way. One of those planks are missing, it fails.
Yeah. Thanks. So basically what you're saying is, I think we go to the lady at the back. So basically what you're saying is we should be looking at win-win-win situations where people actually collectively win rather than somebody loses out. A win-win-win. Yes, go ahead.
So I was going to say this in the last section, and now a few people have touched upon it a little bit, and I want to come back to trying to move away from just focusing on humanity and thinking of, like this lady said, as a whole planet. I think that would help to start looking at a lot of the problems being addressed. So we've talked about the environment and climate change. If we don't look at that, we don't have food security.
Yeah.
If we don't have food security, then huge parts of the world are going to remain in poverty. And we know from history that areas which are more affected by poverty tend to have, often have more corrupt governments because there's a whole range of, there's less access to education, and it's far easier for governments to seize that kind of control. And I think, so what I'm going to say might not be very popular, but I've been vegan for 33 years, and during that time, I've seen the movement towards plant-based foods progress. I've seen the arguments for food security, greater food security with plant-based diets or vegan diets, whichever word you want to use now. There is greater health benefits from plant-based diets. There's not going to be any issues with pandemics from plant-based diets. Pandemics usually occur from jumping from meat to then human hosts. There are a whole series of problems which I believe are being caused by meat-based diets. And if we start looking at more plant-based diets, even if we don't go the whole hog, but if we start looking at that as part of a bigger solution, planetary, for the whole planet, then I think that would actually help to reduce some of the problems and help to provide some stronger solutions.
No, well, very interesting, and I think you're preaching to the converted. I'm a vegan personally, and I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, because the way we see the world beyond the human species makes a big difference in terms of how we act in the world. So if we see animals as something that needs to be protected and nurtured rather than devoured by the mechanized food industry, I think we would think differently. It doesn't mean you don't eat meat, you just don't eat very nastily produced meat necessarily. But as a vegan, you do this on multiple fronts, on social fronts, ecological fronts, etc. So the way we think about the world, not necessarily with food only, but how we think about the world and how we act in the world as a result can make a big difference. So I agree with that. And veganism obviously is something that has taken off and in typical fashion has been accumulated by the capitalist world, because you now have got lots of vegan alternatives. You've got fake chicken and things like that. I don't know why they have to go that road. It would be much better just to actually not eat mass-produced stuff. But there you go. So we're coming back to food, which is good. We're coming back to governance and how we think about the world. We probably have to draw it to conclusions soon, but we've probably got a few more questions. So who was next? This gentleman there with the hat, yeah.
Yes. Just building on what you're saying about win-win-win. I mean, for me, getting clear about what kind of world do we want to live in, what kind of existence do we want to have, And the win-win-win metric is a direction of travel which is really disciplined and really clear.
Yeah.
And it demands of us more and more attention. And I think to see it as a direction, if there's something that loses in the chain, we all lose.
Yeah.
Simple as that. So what does a win-win-win direction of travel look like? And it's not about getting to the end of it. It's about a direction of travel now. And what does that discipline mean for you, for me, for us? And my term for that is love. But love for me is win-win-win.
Yeah. Thank you very much. There was somebody at the front, this gentleman, and there was somebody there as well. Yes. Can I come to you after? Yeah, come to you, Felix. Thank you.
I'd like to try and pull some of this thoughts together, really. We have human rights legislation, but we tend to forget about that very easily. I mean, if you take, say, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and distill it down to, say, 4 points, it is to protect children from harm. So, you know, take children out of poverty, reduce the child abuse, promote assets, you know, clean water, good food, loving families, etc., etc. Provide services for when they're needed. So if you're ill, disabled, or whatever, there's a... And the fourth one is participation. And it's participation that I'd like to take one step further, because it's participation in society. So it starts in schools. So in Scandinavia, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is part of their national curriculum. In this country, it's optional, so some children get exposed to that. The children are very receptive to the idea of what's right and wrong. So they get the opportunity to participate in school councils. They get to participate in their local communities, etc., etc. Where this goes to is something like the digital democracy that is established in Estonia. I mean, I gather every month there is a kind of public debate on television where a contentious issue is debated, and then something like 70% of the population then vote on it. It's not a political vote, but the politicians know exactly where the people stand on a particular issue, and won't tie them if they, promote policies that don't, reflect the population approach on this. So along with that, obviously you need probably something like a single transferable vote, and we need to move away from politics to developing policies that extend past the term of, individual governments.
Very interesting. Now, I was waiting for someone to actually talk about focusing on policies that matter rather than political ideologies, because who knows what the future of political parties really is. Whether we should be much better off actually talking about the issues at hand rather than having them tainted by political ideologies in the first place.
Just look at the difference in the quality of debates between the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Yeah.
The House of Lords generally has a far better in-depth worldwide view rather than party politics, which I find very annoying most of the time.
Good, thank you very much. Now we've got this gentleman. Does anybody really after this gentleman have a burning question? There's another one, and anybody else? 3. Okay, that's unfortunately going to have to be the lot. So we've got 3 more questions or contributions, and then we have to draw it to conclusion.
So, yes, continuing on from policy, as a technologist and looking at the big question, how do we build a better world? I'm a great believer in the power of technology, but one of my mantras is that we need to create wealth from health rather than sickness, because at the moment we have very much an NHS sickness service. And from the point of view of the power of technology, we are at a cusp. AI hasn't really entered into our conversation, but I think we are in a very exciting moment in time, but policies and control are, I think, going to be so mission critical. And the fact that we look at this, how we can come together and really create wealth from health through everything, how we live, how we eat, how our planet works. And technology is very much an answer to that, I believe, but we very much need to have policies and control to be able to not allow the Putins or Trumps of this world to be able to exploit that power. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So technology plays a vital role.
Yeah, actually it's interesting. I think it follows on a little bit from what's just been said, but I'd like to lob a hand grenade into the room because I think...
Well, the last but one question, you now going to lob a grenade.
So it gives people something to go home and think about. You see, recently I've been having a lot of sympathy with conspiracy theorists. Now the trouble with conspiracy theorists is they've got the wrong end of the stick, but they haven't got the wrong stick. They realise there's something deeply wrong in this world. They realise there is a cabal of people effectively controlling us. They realise that there are things like paedophile rings. We know there are elite paedophile rings. The problem is there are some very dangerous people in this world. And it's no good having good intentions if you do not realise, and I'll name them, people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc., are very dangerous people. And they are out to destroy your lives for their own personal benefit. And if we don't wake up to that, frankly, you might as well forget all your platitudes.
Okay, well, we're not going to react to the grenade. It's lying benignly on the middle of the floor, not to be exploded until you get home and have your own individual opinion about it. But we go to the lady at the back for her final contribution, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me contribute for every question that came along. If this is the last one, then I wanted to end with perhaps a positive note after the hand grenade that came in. We've all touched, I think the closest we've come to was the gentleman who mentioned Maslow's pyramid. I come from India, and I've grown up not with an in-depth study, but having some exposure to the Vedas and Upanishads, which are ancient texts of wisdom. And even as I look at just Google on how you define the Upanishads, Upanishads and Vedas were written, these were scriptures that came even before humanity existed, even before the universe existed. But what it essentially mentions is it's a manual of how every living being needs to live their life. And I'm saying living being consciously, I'm not saying human beings, but it's also a manual for how human beings need to tread planet Earth very carefully. And one of the definitions of Upanishads here says it presents a vision of an interconnected universe with a single unifying principle behind the apparent diversity in the cosmos, any articulation of which is called Brahman. One of the byproducts of what I'm trying to say is that we need to elevate our consciousness to spirituality. I know we're all talking about technology, advancements in technology. I come from a technical world as well. But the more technologically advanced we get, the more I dread. I was like, where are we all headed? Why are we moving away from the main quest of humanity, which is spirituality? And one of the byproducts of that is love, as this gentleman mentioned over here. That is what is going to bind us all. So I wanted to just end this on that particular note.
Well, thank you very much. And I think there's definitely a case to be made that there is lots of wisdom in ancient scriptures, in ancient thought, in ancient ideas of the world. When we touched on Taoism, we talked about the Vedas and Upanishads, we talked about Buddhism, etc. So I think we would do well as a species to actually not just seeing this as something that is moribund and out of date, but actually something that talks to us in a slightly different way than the modern world talks to us now. I think just drawing it to conclusion, I'm really, really encouraged because I ran a series last year called The World in 2050. Where we had 8 speakers talking about different aspects of what the world might look like in 2050, and we picked 2050 purely because it's quite close. And what struck me then was that most of the audience in all of the 8 talks felt that they didn't have any role to play personally, individually, to actually what 2050 is going to turn out like. It was all down to governments and big corporations. And I'm hugely encouraged by today's conversation that we actually feel is that we do have a role to play in terms of participation, in terms of holding our leaders, whether they're corporate or political, to account, to actually, we are the architects of the future. And we have a role to play. The prevailing zeitgeist, from what we've discussed today, the global zeitgeist, doesn't seem to be blowing in a very favorable direction at the moment. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play in terms of how the world turns out over the decades to come. So thank you very much for making the time to come today. Just before we close, it would be really interesting to see whether you feel, and also for you online, because this is the first time we've done this on a hybrid basis, does this format work for you guys? Does it actually help? Is it good to have a discussion rather than just a lecture? Yeah? Good. What about online, Trevor? Did you manage to, was it clear enough? Could you hear most of the things? Was it worthwhile?
Yes, very worthwhile. I have something else to say, but you're not going to allow me to say that. No, it was very worthwhile, and I thought it worked very well with the people online being able to contribute. So yes.
Excellent. Good. Well, I'll pass over to Don. Do you want to say final few words?
No, I don't think so. I think that was the thing I was going to say. Do people like the format? Should we do it more often?
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, don't forget.
I'm not sure that's clear, but I think generally yes.
Yeah. And don't forget, my talk on democracy under attack is on the 21st of this month. So if you want to come along to it, it's a lecture rather than a discussion. Although, of course, there will be a Q&A session. So you will be able to have your say. And I won't give you any spoiler alerts just yet, but it will be contentious, put it this way. Even to the extent, is democracy the best form of government? Question mark. But that's on the 21st, and please come along and talk for Julian Beghini's talk in February about the philosophy of global food, because I think we touched on that a lot, and I think he will have a lot to say about the food chain, wasting food, etc. But in the meantime, have a safe journey home. See you next time.